Elena Novak did not flinch when the sheriff looked her over like she was livestock at a county auction. She did not flinch when the woman beside him whispered loud enough for the whole platform to hear. "That's what he sent for. Some foreign girl who don't even speak proper." Elena set her suitcase down on the frozen boards of the Red Hollow station, looked Sheriff Cole Mercer dead in the eye, and said in plain, unbroken English, "Tell me where the woodpile is. I'll have your fire going before the next train leaves. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a single part. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it, because what Elena Novak brought to Red Hollow that November was something no one in that town was ready for. The train had been 4 hours late, and Cole Mercer had spent every one of those hours standing on the platform in 17-degree cold, because he was the kind of man who believed if you asked someone to come to you, the least you could do was be there when they arrived. He had his collar up and his hat pulled low, and he hadn't moved from the spot since 2 in the afternoon. By the time the locomotive finally groaned into the station at 6:30, the sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind off the mountains had teeth. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. The agency letter had said, "Capable woman experienced in household management, unafraid of hard work and harsh conditions." He'd read those words 3 times, because 3 times they'd sounded too good to be true for what he was paying, which wasn't much. Red Hollow, Montana was not a town that attracted anyone with options. It sat at the foot of the Beartooth Range like something the mountains had dropped and forgotten, and the winters there didn't just test people, they broke them. Cole had watched it happen too many times to count. She came off the train last. Most of the passengers had hurried past him. Already ranchers, a traveling salesman, 2 women with children who disappeared fast into waiting arms. And then there was Elena Novak stepping down from the last car with a leather suitcase in one hand and a heavy canvas bag slung over one shoulder, moving with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who had learned a long time ago that panic didn't solve problems. She was lean and capable-looking, somewhere in her late 20s, with dark eyes that moved across the platform in quick, efficient assessments before they landed on him. She didn't wait for him to come to her. "Sheriff Mercer," she said, stopping 2 feet in front of him. Not a question. She'd already identified him from some detail she'd cataloged before he'd even opened his mouth. "Miss Novak," he said. "Train was late." "I know, I was on it." She looked past him at the street beyond the station. "Which way is the house?" Behind Cole near the station door, a woman named Dora Platt had been waiting on her own husband's delayed return and had now found something far more interesting to observe. She was 53, sharp-tongued, and constitutionally unable to keep her thoughts private. She turned to the woman beside her, Agnes Voss, the wife of the mercantile owner, and said at a volume clearly calculated to travel Lord above. He sent all the way to some foreign country for that. Elena's jaw tightened, just barely. Cole caught it. "She ain't foreign," he said, turning his head slightly toward Dora without fully looking at her. "She's from Pennsylvania." "Her family's from Bohemia," Dora said. Like that settled the matter. "My family's from Ohio," Cole said. "Yours is from Germany last I checked. You want to keep going, Dora, or you want to let me get my hired help out of the cold?" Dora's mouth pressed into a thin line. Agnes Voss looked at her shoes. Cole picked up Elena's suitcase before she could stop him. "House is 3 blocks east," he said. "I'll carry this." "I can carry my own bag, Sheriff?" "I know you can. I'm carrying it anyway." He glanced at her once sideways. "Not because you're a woman. Because you've been sitting on a train for 11 hours and I've just been standing here. I've got more energy to spare." Elena studied him for a moment, in a way that felt like she was filing him under a category he hadn't earned yet but might. "Fair enough," she said. They walked. The town was quiet in the way small towns get quiet on bitter nights. Not peaceful, just vacant, everybody sensible, already indoors. The storefronts along Main Street were lit, but the boardwalks were empty, and the snow that had fallen 2 days before had been packed down to a gray-brown crust by wagon wheels and boot heels. Their breath came out in white clouds. Elena walked beside him without complaint, without conversation, without the kind of nervous chattering Cole had half expected from someone arriving alone in an unfamiliar place. "You been a housekeeper before?" He asked more out of courtesy than actual curiosity. The agency had already told him. 6 years, she said. 3 in Philadelphia, 2 in Helena, 1 in Billings. Why'd you leave Billings? A short pause. The family moved to San Francisco. I didn't want to go to San Francisco. What's wrong with San Francisco? Nothing if you like cities that don't stop moving. I prefer somewhere I can hear myself think. Cole almost smiled at that. He didn't let it go all the way. Red Hollow's quiet, all right. I noticed. It gets quieter in January. I know. That's why I came. He didn't ask what she meant by that. He figured she'd meant exactly what she said, and he respected that enough to leave it alone. The house was at the end of Birch Street, a 2-story frame structure that had been built by Cole's predecessor and maintained with varying degrees of attention by the 3 sheriffs who'd occupied it since. It wasn't falling apart. It wasn't anything to be proud of either. The front porch had a board that needed replacing. The north-facing windows leaked cold air if the wind came from the right direction, and the kitchen stovepipe had a joint that needed reseating before it started smoking up the ceiling. Cole knew all of this because he'd been meaning to fix all of it since September. September had turned to October. October had turned to November. He pushed the door open and stepped aside to let her in first. She stood in the entryway for exactly 4 seconds. Cole counted because he was watching her, trying to figure out what she was seeing, what she was calculating. Her eyes went to the fireplace, which was cold and had been for most of the day. To the stack of wood beside it, which was low. To the kitchen doorway. To the staircase. To the window on the north wall where a thin rim of ice had formed along the bottom sill. Woodpile, she said. Where is it? Back of the house. Behind the... She was already moving. He followed her through the kitchen to the back door, and before he'd fully registered what was happening, she'd pulled on her coat, which she'd never fully taken off, opened the back door, and walked out into the dark toward the woodpile that stood against the back fence, half covered by a canvas tarp, weighted down with snow. She lifted the tarp, assessed the supply, loaded her arms, and carried a full stack back inside without being asked, without being told, without any particular expression on her face, beyond the focused look of someone who was simply solving the next problem in sequence. That tarp's going to collapse, she said, setting the wood down beside the hearth. Snow's built up on the right side. You'll want to shake it off before morning, or you'll lose the whole pile to wet. I'll do it when I go back out. I'll do it when I'm done here. She knelt at the fireplace and began building the fire with the brisk competence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Tinder first, then small splits. Then the larger pieces laid exactly right. She didn't fumble with the matches. Do you have coffee? Tin above the stove. Supper. Cole hesitated. The truth was he'd planned to fry some salt pork and open a can of beans, which was what he did most nights in winter when he was too tired to care more about his food than its temperature. He had the grace to be faintly embarrassed about this in the present company. I was going to... I'll find something. She stood, brushed her hands on her skirt, and moved to the kitchen with that same unhurried efficiency. He heard her open the larder. A silence. Then, Sheriff. Cole? He said from the doorway. She looked back at him. What? Cole, if you're going to be in my house all winter. Sheriff is going to get old fast. She seemed to consider this with the same measured pragmatism she applied to everything else. Cole, she said like she was trying on the word for fit. You have dried beans, cornmeal, 4 cans of tomatoes, and something in a jar I haven't identified yet. That's bear lard. Of course it is. She turned back to the larder. I'll need you to put an order in at the Mercantile tomorrow. I'll write it out tonight. Voss will give you credit on my account. Just tell him, I'd prefer to go myself. She pulled the cornmeal down from the shelf. I like to see what I'm buying. That was the first night. It was unremarkable in the way that most things that matter are unremarkable at the time. A woman arrived, a fire got built, a meal got cooked. Cole ate cornbread and bean soup at his own kitchen table, and it was the best meal he'd had in 4 months, and neither of them said anything about that. Elena ate across from him quickly and without ceremony, and then cleared the dishes and washed them before he could think to offer to help. And he suspected if he had offered, she would have thanked him politely and declined. He showed her the room at the top of the stairs, which he'd made an effort to clean up, and which still wasn't much. A narrow bed, a dresser, a hook on the wall for clothes, a small window that faced east and would catch the morning light. "It's warm enough," she said, which he knew was her way of saying it was fine. "There's a latch on the inside." She looked at him once. "I figured," she said. And then more quietly, "Thank you for that." He nodded and went downstairs, and he heard her close the door and turn the latch, and he sat by the fire she'd built, and felt for the first time since October, like his house was something more than a place where he slept between shifts. By the end of the first week, Elena Novak had done 3 things that Cole hadn't asked her to do, and that no previous housekeeper he'd had too briefly, both of whom had lasted less than a season, had thought to do at all. First, she'd reseated the stovepipe joint in the kitchen, using a strip of metal she'd cut from an old tin bucket, and a technique she'd apparently learned from a tinsmith in Helena. Second, she'd replaced the bad board on the front porch, using lumber she'd talked out of Voss at the Mercantile, and a hammer she'd found in the shed. Third, she'd begun keeping a household ledger, a neat, precise record of every expenditure against Cole's monthly account, every supply in the larder, every item that needed replacement, and when. He found the ledger on the kitchen table one morning and stood there for a solid minute reading it. "You didn't have to do this," he said, when she came in from outside stomping snow from her boots. "I know. I mean, I didn't ask for it." "You need it," she said simply. "You've been overpaying Voss on salt by about 15 cents a pound. I noticed when I went in Tuesday. I didn't say anything to him yet because I wanted to show you first." She pointed to the relevant line in the ledger. "There it is." Cole looked at the line. He looked at her. "You want me to take that up with Voss?" "That's your call. I just wanted you to know." She hung her coat and moved to the stove. Breakfast in 20 minutes. He thought about it all through breakfast, and then he walked to the Mercantile and had a quiet, factual conversation with Hiram Voss that resulted in a 15-cent per pound adjustment and a credit against his account for the previous 2 months. Voss looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant the whole time, and when Cole walked out, he had the distinct impression that by noon, half the town would know that the foreign girl at the sheriff's house was already causing trouble. He didn't care. He was $8 ahead. The children found her by the second week. It started with Thomas Garrett, who was 8 years old and the son of the livery owner, and who had the remarkable talent of appearing wherever he was least expected. He showed up at Elena's back door on a Wednesday afternoon because he'd seen smoke from the kitchen and smelled something that turned out to be rye bread and was operating entirely on instinct. Elena opened the back door, looked at him and said, "Are you hungry or just curious?" Thomas thought about it seriously. "Both," he said. "Come in," she said. "Wipe your boots." He did. She gave him bread and butter and a cup of hot milk, and while he ate, she kept working at the counter without making a production of it, without the kind of exaggerated adult attention that made children self-conscious. She just let him be there. By the time he left an hour later, he had learned without quite realizing he was being taught how to tell when bread dough had proofed long enough by how it felt when you pressed a finger into it. He came back the next day. He brought his friend Will Hart. By Friday, there were 4 children sitting at Elena's kitchen table. Cole came home for lunch on that Friday and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at this development with an expression that probably said more than he intended. Elena glanced at him over the heads of the children, without interrupting the conversation she was having with Thomas about the properties of ice, and whatever she read in his face, she apparently found acceptable, because she simply turned back and kept talking. "You knew this was going to happen?" he asked her later when the children had gone. "People go where it's warm," she said. "Children more than most. This is a sheriff's house. It's also the warmest house on Birch Street now. You want me to turn them away?" He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. Then I'll need another pound of butter on the next order. Millie Voss. Hiram's wife, not to be confused with her husband in terms of character, since she was considerably kinder, was the first adult in town to cross Elena's threshold willingly. She came on a Thursday, in the third week, ostensibly to drop off a wrapped portion of smoked ham that she said was left over from a Sunday roast, and would only go to waste. Elena accepted it with genuine thanks and invited her in for coffee. Millie stayed 2 hours. She came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. Through Millie, Cole got a clearer picture of what people were saying about Elena when he wasn't there to hear it. Some of it was the ordinary small-town suspicion of anything unfamiliar. Her origins, her accent, the confident way she moved through Voss's store, making her selections without deference. Some of it was less charitable. Dora Platt had apparently told at least 4 people that Elena was putting on airs, and that any woman who kept a household ledger on a lawman's salary was either scheming for something or would have the poor man in debt by spring. Cole heard about this from Millie, who told Elena, who told Cole when she thought he should know. "What do you want me to do about it?" he asked. "Nothing," Elena said. "People like Dora change their minds when they see results. They don't change them when they're argued with." "That's a patient way of thinking about it." She shrugged one shoulder. "I've been a foreign girl my whole life," she said. "You learn which fights to have." He sat with that for a long time after she'd gone back to the kitchen. November turned to December. The cold dropped below 0 and stayed there. Elena sealed the windows against the drafts with strips of oilcloth. She cut herself, organized the woodpile by size, so the fires could be built faster, and began teaching herself which of the town's back road shortcuts Cole used, so she could have his dinner warm at the right time, regardless of what kept him late. She learned his patterns the way she learned everything, by observation, by cataloging, by quiet attention. She knew within 10 days that he drank his coffee black and too strong, and didn't notice that he'd skip lunch 3 days running if no one put something in front of him, that he came home from hard days quieter than from easy ones, and that quiet meant leave him alone for 20 minutes and then put food near him, and he'd come back to himself by degrees. She never said she'd noticed any of this. She just acted on it. One night in early December, he came home from a call-out to the Garrett Ranch, where a fence-line dispute had nearly turned ugly, and he was cold through to the marrow, and tired in the specific way that came not from physical effort, but from the weight of being the only thing standing between people and their worst instincts. He sat down at the kitchen table, and Elena put a plate in front of him and a cup of coffee, and then sat down across from him without speaking, and he found to his own surprise that that was exactly right. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of someone who was simply present and didn't require anything from him. After a while, he said, "The Garretts and the Kohlers have been fighting over that fence line for 6 years." "I know," she said. "Thomas told me." "Thomas is 8. 8-year-olds in small towns know everything." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Who's in the right?" "Kohler, technically, by about 12 feet. But old Garrett built that fence 30 years ago, and he's 71, and his heart's not good, and telling him he's been wrong for 3 decades is going to put him in the ground before spring." Elena was quiet. Then, "Is there a way to give Kohler his 12 feet without telling Garrett he's wrong?" Cole looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Survey the line officially. Put it on paper. Give Kohler the legal acknowledgement. But frame the paperwork as a clarification of an ambiguous boundary rather than a correction of an error. Let Garrett believe the line was always disputed, not that he was simply wrong." Cole set down his fork. He stopped. "That would actually work." "Most people don't need to be right," Elena said. "They just need to not be told they're wrong." He stared at her for a long moment. She picked up her coffee and drank it without looking particularly pleased with herself, which somehow made it worse. "Where'd you learn to think like that?" he asked. "Watching people," she said. "It's what you do when you're new to a place and you don't know the rules yet. You watch before you speak." He thought about that long after she'd gone to bed. He thought about it again in the morning, when he filed the fence line survey request with county records and wrote boundary clarification in the purpose line. He thought about it a third time 2 weeks later, when both Garrett and Kohler came to him independently to say they were satisfied with the outcome. By the time December turned to January, Cole Mercer had stopped thinking of Elena Novak as help for the winter. He wasn't entirely sure yet what he thought of her instead, but he knew with the same bone-deep certainty he'd learned to trust after 20 years of reading people that whatever Elena Novak was, she was something Red Hollow hadn't had before and was going to find it very hard to let go of. He just didn't know yet whether he meant the town or himself. January and Red Hollow didn't arrive, it invaded. The temperature dropped to 22 below on the third night of the new year and stayed there like it had decided to make a permanent home, and the wind that came down off the Beartooth Range didn't howl so much as it pressed a constant relentless weight against every door and window in town, testing for weakness the way a creditor tests for excuses. Cole had seen bad winters before. This one felt different. This one felt personal. Elena felt it too. He could tell not because she said anything she rarely said things she didn't need to say, but because she started waking up earlier. He'd come downstairs at 5:30 and find the kitchen already warm, the coffee already made, and Elena already at the table with her ledger open and a list half-written beside it. She was planning ahead, calculating supplies against projected duration, treating the winter the way she treated every problem as something that could be managed if you were honest enough about what you were dealing with. "You're up early," he said the first morning he caught her at it. "So are you." "I've got rounds. I've got a larder that's going to run short on flour by the 15th if I don't adjust the bread schedule." She turned the ledger so he could see it without getting up. "You need to put an order in today, not tomorrow. Today." He looked at the numbers. They were precise and correct and slightly alarming. That much flour. That and a second 50-pound sack of dried beans. The Harts are down to almost nothing. Mrs. Hart came by yesterday, and she didn't say so directly, but I could see it in how she looked at the cornbread I put out. She ate 3 pieces and took the last one home wrapped in her handkerchief. Cole set his coffee down. The Harts. Will's father hurt his back in November. He hasn't been able to work full shifts since. Elena's voice was level factual. She wasn't performing concern. She just had it the way some people have a sense of direction built in, always oriented. "I'm not suggesting charity in a way that embarrasses them. I'm suggesting you let me arrange things so the surplus finds its way to the right places without anyone having to ask." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been doing this already, haven't you?" It wasn't quite a question. She met his eyes and didn't look away. "A little," she said. "How much is a little?" "Nothing that's broken the account. Everything I've moved around I've logged." She turned to the back of the ledger, where a second separate column of entries ran down the page in her precise, compact handwriting. "You can check it." He didn't need to check it. That was the thing about Elena. She always left everything checkable, every number recorded, every decision documented, as if she understood that trust wasn't something you asked for, but something you built line by line in a ledger that anyone could read. "All right," he said. She nodded and turned back to her list. He put his coat on and went out into the dark to place the order before Voss's opened because she'd said today, and she'd meant it. The order was waitings on the loading dock by noon. By 2 o'clock, Elena had arranged for the second sack of beans to be delivered to the Hart house under the pretense of an ordering error on the mercantile's part. Too much stock, no room to store it, would they mind taking it off their hands? Mrs. Hart had apparently accepted this fiction with great dignity and said she'd be happy to help out. Cole heard about this from Millie Voss, who'd seen the delivery, and put it together and found it so perfectly executed that she'd told the story to 3 people already, all of them women, and every one of them had listened with the particular attention of people hearing something that confirmed what they'd already begun to suspect about Elena Novak. The children were the clearest evidence. By the second week of January, Elena's kitchen table had become a fixture in certain young lives, the way fixed stars become fixtures. Something you navigate by without thinking about it consciously. Thomas Garrett came every day after school unless the weather made it genuinely dangerous. Will Hart came 3 days a week. A girl named Clara Webb, who was 10 and serious-minded, and reminded Cole uncomfortably of Elena herself, came on Tuesdays and Saturdays and sat at the end of the table doing arithmetic problems that Elena had apparently been setting her problems that were a full year ahead of what Clara's school teacher was covering in class. Cole didn't ask about the arithmetic problems. He walked past the kitchen one afternoon and heard Elena say, "You've got the method right, but you're rounding too early. Hold the full number until the last step, or you'll lose precision." And Clara said, "Why does precision matter if the answer's close enough?" And Elena said without missing a beat, "Because close enough is how bridges fall down." And Clara went quiet and started the problem over. Cole walked on. He was smiling before he reached the end of the hall, and he made himself stop, though he wasn't entirely sure why. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns usually does not, with a dramatic confrontation, but with a whisper that grew legs. Dora Platt had been quiet since Cole had shut her down at the station in November. But quiet for Dora was not the same as inactive. She'd been watching. She'd been talking to people she trusted to carry her opinions further than she could carry them herself. And by the 3rd week of January, what she'd been saying had taken a particular shape. Cole heard the shape of it from an unexpected source, Danny Kohler, who was 14 and the son of the rancher, whose fence line dispute Cole had resolved back in December, and who came to the back door one afternoon looking for Thomas, and found instead Cole himself, who had come home early with a pulled muscle in his shoulder from breaking up a wagon accident on the North Road. Danny was sharp the way ranch kids often were. Practical intelligence honed by years of learning that carelessness had consequences, and that the gap between noticing something and acting on it was usually the gap between a problem solved and a disaster. He looked at Cole's shoulder, looked at the house, and said, "She all right?" Cole blinked. "Who?" "Miss Elena. Mrs. Platt's been saying things." Cole kept his voice level. "What kind of things?" Danny shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the universal gesture of a young person deciding how much truth an adult could handle. "That she's getting above herself. That she's got the children here every day like she's setting herself up as a school teacher when she ain't been invited to teach. That she's interfering with things that ain't her business, the Hart business, the fence thing, all of it. Mrs. Platt says it ain't natural for a hired woman to have that much reach into a town's business." A pause. "She also said she heard you'd given her access to your full household account, which apparently some people think is—" He stopped. "Think is what?" Cole said. Danny looked at him with the directness of someone who'd decided to go all the way. "Improper," he said. "The way Mrs. Platt means it." Cole stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Danny," and meant it, which was why Danny left looking slightly relieved. Elena was in the kitchen when Cole came in. She was cutting dried apples for a pie, and she looked up once when she heard his footsteps, and apparently read something in his face because she set the knife down and waited. "Dora Platt's calling your behavior improper," he said. "She's been working the social circuit with it for at least 2 weeks. Elena looked at him steadily. "What does she mean by improper?" "She means the children, the Harts, the ledger access, the reach." He said the last word with the exact flat dryness he'd used when Danny said it, which communicated everything he thought about it. "She's got people listening." "What do you want to do?" Elena said. That was the other thing about her. She never assumed. She never acted like she had a right to his decisions or his house in any way that went beyond what she'd been hired for, and she always asked. He looked at her. "Nothing," he said. "Same as before. You keep doing what you're doing." Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly. Something more like the recognition that she'd been holding something braced for a blow, and the blow hadn't come. "People will keep talking," she said. "People in Red Hollow have been talking since before either of us got here," Cole said. "I've been the subject of it since I took this badge. You live with it, or you leave, and you don't strike me as someone who leaves." She picked up the knife. "I'm not," she said. He went upstairs to check his shoulder in the mirror and came down 20 minutes later to the smell of apple pie starting in the oven, which was, he thought, not a bad thing to come back to. The first real crack in the town's collective skepticism came at the end of January in the form of Martha Denby's baby, who arrived 3 weeks early in the middle of a Tuesday morning when the temperature was -15, and the only doctor Red Hollow had, Dr. Amos Pruitt, was out on a call to a ranch 12 miles east and could not be reached in time. Cole got the summons from Ray Denby, who showed up at the sheriff's office, white-faced and barely coherent, and Cole went with him immediately. And when they arrived at the Denby house, and it became clear that the baby was coming now, and that Martha was in serious distress, it was Elena who stepped forward. She'd come with Cole because she'd been in the office dropping off the week's account when Ray Denby arrived, and she'd simply followed without being asked. And Cole hadn't had the presence of mind to tell her not to. Later he would consider that moment one of the luckier accidents of his life. She asked 3 questions in rapid succession. How long, what position had she had? Any warning pains the night before? And Mrs. Garrity, the neighbor who'd come first, answered all 3. And Elena nodded once and went to the bedroom, and that was that. Cole and Ray Denby waited in the front room. Ray sat in a chair and put his head in his hands and couldn't speak. Cole stood by the window and listened to the sounds from the bedroom and tried to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. 40 minutes later, Elena came out. "Healthy boy," she said to Ray. "Small but breathing well. Your wife is tired, but she'll be fine." She looked at Ray until he'd absorbed enough of that to raise his head and look back. "You can go in." Ray Denby went in. Cole looked at Elena. "Where did you learn?" he started. "Helena," she said. "The family I worked for had a midwife neighbor. I assisted twice." She looked down at her hands. They were steady. "Go get Dr. Pruitt when he gets back. He should examine them properly." "Already sent Tommy Garrett." She nodded. She sat down in the chair Ray Denby had vacated and stayed there for a moment, very still, in the way of someone who has been moving fast and needs the sudden stillness to settle. Cole sat across from her and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. Dr. Pruitt arrived 2 hours later, examined mother and child, and then found Cole on the Denby's porch and said without preamble, "Whoever helped that woman knew what she was doing. That baby was breech. If it had gone another 30 minutes without proper repositioning..." He stopped and shook his head. Cole said, "I'll tell her you said so." "You do that," Pruitt said. "And tell her I'd like to talk to her when she has a moment. Professionally." By the time the story had made its way around Red Hollow, which took approximately 48 hours, because that was about the speed of light in a town of this size, it had acquired several embellishments that Elena would have found embarrassing, and that Cole thought were, if anything, an understatement. What mattered was the shape of it. What mattered was that the women who'd been listening to Dora Platt's version of Elena Novak now had a different version to consider, one that had a live, healthy baby in it, and a mother alive to nurse him. Dora Platt did not issue a retraction. Dora Platt was not constitutionally capable of issuing retractions. But she was quiet for 2 weeks, which in Red Hollow was close enough. February came in hard, and the cold didn't lift. Cole added extra rounds to his schedule, checking on the elderly, the isolated, the families he knew were stretched thin. Elena's kitchen table acquired 2 new regulars, Mrs. Pruitt, who came Thursdays to talk with Elena about things Cole suspected had more to do with Dr. Pruitt's professional interest than social warmth, and old Caleb Ford, who was 73 and a widower, and who'd started appearing at the back door on cold mornings, the same way Thomas Garrett had appeared in November, operating on some instinct that warmth and coffee were available if you didn't make a production of wanting them. Elena never turned anyone away. She also never made anyone feel like a charity case, which was a rarer skill than most people gave it credit for. She treated Caleb Ford exactly the way she treated Cole and the children, and Millie Voss directly respectfully, as if their presence at her table was a matter of course and not a favor anyone needed to be grateful for. Cole watched this and thought about what Danny Kohler had said. "She's getting above herself." He turned that phrase over in his mind until he'd figured out what bothered him about it. Which was this: it assumed that a woman like Elena had a natural station and that any expansion beyond it was transgression. That the household she'd been hired to run had a fixed perimeter and that anything she did outside that perimeter was overreach. But the perimeter of a household was not a fixed thing. It was a living thing. It grew toward the warmth. One night in late February, after the last visitor had gone and the fire had settled, and Cole was going through the week's correspondence at the kitchen table, he looked up and found Elena standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She didn't move. "Just thinking." "About what?" She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become something different from an ordinary pause. "About whether this is what I hoped it would be," she said finally. "When I got on that train in November, whether it's what I was looking for." Cole put the letter down. "Is it?" She looked at him with those direct, dark eyes that had been filing him under various categories since the first night on the platform, and said, "I don't know yet." A pause. "But it's closer than anything else has been." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he picked up the letter. "Well," he said, "winter's not over yet." She turned back toward the hall. "No," she said, "it isn't." He listened to her footsteps on the stairs. Outside, the wind pressed against the north wall of the house and found for the first time since November nothing to get through. The storm didn't announce itself the way people later claimed it did. People in Red Hollow would say afterward that they'd seen it coming for 3 days, that the sky had been sending signals anyone with sense could read, that the old-timers had been warning about it since February. That was the kind of thing people said after a disaster. They reconstructed the signs because it was more comfortable to believe the world had warned them than to admit it had simply arrived. Cole knew better. He'd been watching that sky since the 1st of March, and what he'd seen was an ordinary late winter gray, the kind that meant cold and wind, and maybe another 6 inches, but nothing that required rearranging your life around. He was wrong. He would admit that freely for the rest of his life. The first signal that actually meant something came on a Wednesday morning when Caleb Ford showed up at the back door at 6:15 instead of his usual 7:30, which was unusual enough that Elena had the door open before he knocked. Caleb was not a man who rushed. He'd been moving at the same deliberate pace since before Cole was born, and the fact that he was moving faster now said more than anything he might have said with words. "Barometric pressure dropped overnight," Caleb said, stepping inside and pulling his coat off with hands that were stiffer than usual. "Dropped fast. My knees tell me one thing, the feel of the air tells me another. The two of them together tell me to get inside and stay there." Elena looked at him. "How bad?" "Bad," he said. "The 87 kind of bad if I had to put a name on it." Elena knew the blizzard of 1887. Everyone in Montana knew the blizzard of 1887. It had killed cattle by the hundreds of thousands and people by the dozens, and had rearranged the ranching economy of the entire territory in the course of 3 days. She turned to the window for exactly 1 second, then turned back and said, "Cole." He was already putting his coat on. The next 4 hours were the last organized hours Red Hollow would have for 3 days. Cole moved through the town in a systematic sweep, hitting every house on his route and every ranch within reasonable riding distance, delivering the same message in variations suited to whoever answered the door. Get your wood inside. Get your animals secured. Get your water supply established. Don't go out once it hits. At the Kohler Ranch, 4 miles north, he found Danny and his father already moving cattle toward the lower barn, and stopped long enough to help them close and bar the doors. At the Garrett livery, Thomas's father had every animal inside and was nailing extra boards across the hayloft opening. At the Hart house, Will's father, back hurt or not, was stacking wood against the south wall with the grim efficiency of a man who understood the stakes. Cole rode back into town at noon, and the sky had changed. It had gone from gray to white, a flat, sourceless white that pressed down on everything and eliminated shadow and depth, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours, and the wind was no longer pressing from one direction, but circling confused and hungry looking for a way in. He got back to Birch Street and found Elena on the front porch with her coat on and a list in her hand. "I need 30 minutes, she said. "What for?" She handed him the list. "Mrs. Garrity is alone. So is Caleb. The Webbs have Clara and 2 younger ones, and Ben Webb went out to his brother's place yesterday and hasn't come back. Mrs. Pruitt is 7 months along and shouldn't be alone in this. That's 4 households within 2 blocks that need to be here before the storm locks in." Cole looked at the list. He looked at her. "You already arranged this. I sent Thomas to Mrs. Garrity and Clara Webb to get her mother. Caleb's already inside." She tucked the remaining list into her coat pocket. "Mrs. Pruitt, I'd like you to go for. She'll listen to the badge faster than she'll listen to me right now." Cole didn't ask how she'd thought of all this while he'd been covering a 4-mile circuit. He just got back on his horse. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Elena's house, Cole's house, had 11 people in it. By 4, when the storm arrived in its full and terrible seriousness, there were 16. They came the way people come to warmth in a crisis, without ceremony, without pride, carrying children and blankets, and whatever they'd grabbed on the way out the door. Mrs. Garrity brought a jar of pickled beets because it was what she'd had in her hands when Thomas knocked. The youngest Webb child, who was 4 and named Peter, brought a wooden horse. Dora Platt arrived at 4:30 with her husband Harold, who'd had the sense to override whatever his wife's feelings about Elena were when the wind reached 40 miles an hour, and stood in the doorway looking as though she wasn't sure whether to thank the woman or maintain her position. Elena opened the door wider and said, "Come in, Dora. Harold, there's coffee on the stove." Harold came in immediately. Dora followed. She didn't say anything, and Elena didn't require her to. Cole watched this from across the room and thought that he probably could have stood there watching Elena manage that moment for a very long time. He didn't have time. Outside, the blizzard had stopped being a weather event and started being an emergency. The temperature was approaching 30 below. The wind had exceeded 50 miles an hour. Visibility on Main Street was down to 8 feet. Cole knew this because he'd gone out twice already in the first hour, once to check on the horses he'd gotten into the back shed, and once to check on the south-facing side of the house, where the wind was doing its most aggressive work against the siding. The second time he went out, Elena followed him to the back door and handed him a pack he hadn't asked for. He opened it. Hot coffee in a sealed tin, 2 pairs of dry wool socks, 3 biscuits wrapped in cloth, a length of rope. "The rope's to tie yourself to the porch post if you have to go further than the shed," she said. "I read about a man in the '87 storm who got turned around 15 feet from his own back door." He took the pack. He took her wrist for one brief second. Not romantically, not dramatically. Just the grip of one person, telling another person that they'd been heard, and it mattered. Then he went out. The Kohler boy nearly died for a foolish reason. Danny Kohler was 14 and stubborn, and had been making decisions on the ranch since he was 9 because his father's health had never been reliable. He knew cattle. He knew how to work. What he didn't know, what no one had told him because the generation that had survived '87 was mostly gone, was that in a whiteout at 30 below, the distance between knowing where you are and being completely fatally lost is measured not in yards, but in steps. Cole found him because the rope Elena had insisted on, the one tied to his wrist and to the post at the back door, let him go further than he should have and come back. He'd gone out to check the shed and heard something that wasn't wind and followed it, and the something turned out to be Danny Kohler on his hands and knees in the snow 40 feet from Cole's back fence, which put him 200 feet from where he thought he was and moving in the wrong direction. The boy couldn't speak. His hands were white. He was moving purely on instinct, the same instinct that had kept him from stopping, which was the only reason he was still alive. Cole got him up and got the rope around him and got him back to the house. Elena had the door open before they reached the porch. She didn't ask what happened. She took one look at Danny's hands and his face and said, "Table." And somebody cleared the kitchen table, and Danny was on it, and Elena was working before Cole had fully registered they were back inside. "Warm water," she said. "Not hot, warm. If it's too hot, the tissue shock is worse." She was already pulling Danny's boots off, checking his feet. "Mrs. Garrity, I need that second blanket from the bedroom cupboard." "Harold." Can you put more wood on the front room fire right now, please? Not later now. People moved. That was the thing Cole noted from where he stood in the doorway, half frozen himself, and watching her work. People moved when she told them to, without the pause they usually inserted between being told something and deciding whether to do it. Harold Platt, who had never in his life taken direction from a hired woman, was on his feet and at the woodpile before the sentence was finished. Mrs. Garrity was at the bedroom cupboard. Will Hart's mother was already filling a basin with water and testing the temperature the way Elena had just described. Danny Kohler opened his eyes 20 minutes later. His color was coming back. His hands were going to be painful for a week, but he wasn't going to lose anything. He looked up at Elena and said in the thin voice of someone who'd been genuinely frightened and was only now starting to process it. "Am I going to be all right?" "You're going to be fine," Elena said. "And when you're warm enough to sit up, you and I are going to have a conversation about what you were doing out there alone." Danny blinked. "Are you going to yell at me?" "No," Elena said. "I'm going to explain exactly how close you came and make sure you understand it. That's worse than yelling." A sound moved through the room that wasn't quite laughter, but was adjacent to it, the specific sound of people who are frightened and relieved in equal measure and need somewhere for the feeling to go. Even Dora Platt made a sound. Cole caught her face from across the room, the careful, composed face of a woman who had just watched something she couldn't argue with and was quietly, privately revising her position. She didn't say anything, but she crossed the room to where Elena was still bent over Danny and put a hand on the boy's blanket and straightened it the way an older woman does when she doesn't have words and needs her hands to say something instead. Elena looked up, met Dora's eyes for 1 second, and nodded once. Dora nodded back. That was all. But Cole had been reading people for 20 years, and he knew what he'd just witnessed. The storm lasted 2.5 days. 16 people lived inside Cole Mercer's house for 62 hours, and in that time, Elena did not stop. She rationed the food with mathematical precision enough that no one went hungry, careful enough that the supply lasted the full duration, with a half-day's reserve remaining. She organized sleeping arrangements on a rotation that gave everyone adequate rest without creating the kind of close-quarters friction that builds fast when people are frightened and crowded. She kept the children occupied and the adults calm and the fires burning at the right level to maintain warmth without burning through wood too fast. Cole helped where she needed help and stayed out of her way where she didn't, which turned out to be most of the time. He watched her move through those 62 hours with the specific admiration of a man who understood competence because his life had required it of him, watching another person demonstrate a level of it he hadn't expected and couldn't dismiss. On the second night, after the children were asleep and most of the adults had gone quiet, Cole found himself sitting on the floor with his back against the front room wall, too tired to move to a chair, and Elena sat down beside him with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking if he wanted it. "You need to sleep," she said. "So do you." "I will when you do." He drank the coffee. Outside, the wind was still working, though something in its quality had shifted. It was starting to sound less like an attack and more like an argument winding down. "The Kohler cattle," he said. "I got them into the lower barn, but I don't know if the hands were able to get the upper herd moved before it hit. Danny says his father knows what to do. He's done it before." A pause. "Danny also says his father borrowed money from Heller's Bank in November to cover the fall feed costs, and the bank's been sending notices about the payment schedule." Cole turned to look at her. "How does Danny know about the bank notices?" "He found the letters. He's been worried about it since December and hasn't known who to tell." She looked into her coffee cup. "I think he came out in the storm to check the cattle, because he feels like if he loses them, his father loses everything, and he's been carrying that by himself for 3 months. Cole sat with that for a moment. A 14-year-old boy alone with a secret that felt like the weight of a family's survival going out into a whiteout, because staying still was more frightening than the storm. He understood that logic better than he wished he did. "I'll talk to Bill Kohler when this is over," he said. "There are options with Hellers that Bill might not know about, and there's a territory assistance program for ranches that took hard winter losses. I can file the paperwork." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're good at this." He looked at her. "At what?" "At knowing what people need that isn't what they're asking for." She turned her head to look at him directly, and in the firelight, her face had the particular quality of someone who was choosing their words carefully, not because they were being evasive, but because they were being precise. Danny came out in a blizzard because he needed someone to trust with the real problem. You already knew how to solve it. You just needed to know it existed. Cole held her gaze for a beat longer than conversation required. "You're the one who found out it existed," he said. "That's what I'm here for," she said quietly. The words sat in the air between them with more weight than their plain meaning accounted for. Cole didn't push at them, and Elena didn't add to them, and they sat together in the dying firelight, listening to the storm decide to end, and neither of them moved for a long time. The morning the blizzard broke, the sky came back blue and sharp and almost violent in its clarity, the way skies do after that kind of violence, as if the world was trying to compensate. Cole went out at first light to assess the damage. The north fence was down in 2 places. The shed roof had lost boards. 3 of the boardwalk sections on Main Street had been blown clear off their footings and were sitting at odd angles in the street. 2 windows in the old assay office had given way. He was standing in the middle of Main Street, taking stock, when he heard boots on the packed snow behind him, and turned to find 7 people, 4 men, 3 women, coming out of various houses with tools already in hand, moving toward the damage without being asked, without being organized, without any particular authority telling them where to go. He watched them for a moment, confused by the coordination of it. Then he realized they weren't coordinated. They just all knew what needed doing and were doing it, which was different. That kind of thing didn't happen in a town by accident. It happened when someone had spent 3 months quietly teaching people to look at a problem and move toward it, instead of waiting for someone else to move first. He turned and looked back at his house, where smoke was already rising from the chimney, where he knew without looking, Elena was already making breakfast for 16 people on a wood supply she'd managed to within a cord's margin of what was needed. He stood in the middle of the ruined street in the hard blue morning and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time, and wasn't entirely sure he knew what to do with. He turned back toward the damage and started working, but he was thinking about a woman who'd stepped off a train in November with a canvas bag and a ledger, and a way of looking at problems that made them smaller than they'd seemed before she arrived. And he was thinking that whatever word a person used for what she'd done to Red Hollow in 4 months, the word that kept coming back to him, the only word that fit, was irreplaceable. The cleanup took 11 days. Not 11 days of organized, scheduled effort. 11 days of the kind of work that happens in a town that's been shaken hard enough to remember what it actually is, which is a collection of people who need each other whether they've admitted it or not. Cole coordinated the structural repairs. He filed the damage assessments with the territory office, arranged for emergency lumber from the mill in Billings, and personally helped reset the boardwalk sections on Main Street, because he was the kind of man who didn't ask others to do what he wouldn't do himself, and because physical work was the only thing that quieted the particular noise in his head that had started on the second night of the blizzard when Elena had sat down beside him in the firelight and said, "That's what I'm here for." He hadn't examined that noise too closely. He'd been busy. He intended to keep being busy as long as possible. Elena, for her part, treated the aftermath of the storm the same way she'd treated the storm itself, as a logistics problem, with human variables solvable, with enough attention and the right sequence of actions. The 16 people who'd sheltered in the house went home over the course of that first blue morning, departing in 1s and 2s, with the slightly dazed gratitude of people who'd been through something together and weren't quite sure yet how to account for it. Elena sent each one off with something: a jar of soup, the rest of the biscuits, a bundle of extra kindling for the first fire in a cold returned house. Small things. Practical things. The kind of things that said, "I thought about you specifically," without making anyone feel beholden. Dora Platt was the last to leave. She stood in the doorway for a full 15 seconds, after Harold had already walked ahead, and Elena waited with the patience of someone who'd learned to let silences complete themselves. Then, Dora said, "You kept a good house through that." It was the most qualified compliment in the English language, and they both knew it. Elena said, "Thank you, Dora," and meant it without irony, which was its own kind of mastery, and Dora walked out, and the door closed, and Elena turned back to the kitchen and the work of putting the house back to rights. Cole came home that first evening and found the kitchen cleaner than it had been before 16 people had lived in it for 62 hours, which he suspected said something fundamental about Elena's relationship with disorder. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "How are you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it apparently warranted. "Tired," she said. But the kind of tired that means something got done. He understood that kind of tired. It was better than the other kind. The town council met on the Thursday after the storm, 4 days after the sky cleared, in the back room of Voss's Mercantile, the way they always met, and Cole attended the way he always attended as a courtesy, since his official authority was law enforcement and not civic governance, but because in a town this size, the categories overlapped and everyone knew it. The council was 5 men: Hiram Voss, the mercantile owner; Judge Walter Creed, who was 70 and sharp, and had been presiding over Red Hollow's legal matters since before it had a proper name; Ray Denby, whose wife had delivered the healthy boy 2 months ago; Frank Garrett Thomas's father; and Elias Webb, Clara's father, who'd made it back from his brother's place the morning after the storm ended, and had arrived home to find his wife and 3 children safe and fed in the sheriff's house. Cole sat and listened while they went through the damage inventory and the repair costs and the territory assistance request. And then Judge Creed set down his papers and looked around the table and said what everyone in the room had been waiting for someone with enough standing to say. "We need to talk about Miss Novak." The room was quiet. Cole kept his face neutral. "She managed 16 people through 62 hours of the worst storm this town has seen in 30 years, Creed said. "She got Danny Kohler back inside before he lost his hands. She's been keeping this community's vulnerable households supplied and connected since November, without being asked and without charging a cent beyond her wage." He looked at each man at the table in turn. "She came here as a housekeeper. What she's been doing is considerably more than housekeeping." Hiram Voss shifted in his seat. "She works for the sheriff," he said. Not argumentatively, more like a man checking where the lines were. "She works in the sheriff's house," Creed said. "That's not the same thing. And whatever she works as what this town owes her is a recognition that doesn't come from one man's household account." He turned to Cole. "I'm not stepping on your authority. I'm asking what you think we should do." Cole chose his words deliberately. "I think you should ask her what she needs," he said. "Not tell her what you're going to give her. Ask her." There was a pause. Frank Garrett nodded slowly. Elias Webb said, "That's fair." Ray Denby, who had a personal reason to agree that outweighed everyone else's by about 7 pounds in 4 months, said simply, "Whatever she wants, she's earned." They asked her on a Saturday, which was 3 days later, which was how long it took Judge Creed to put together the formal language, because Creed was a man who believed that the form of a thing mattered as much as its substance, and that you didn't call a woman before a civic council without doing it correctly. Cole told her the night before. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, their regular positions, the ones they'd settled into by December, and never changed, and said, "The council wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. Judge Creed will be there." Elena set down her cup. "What for?" "To offer you something. I don't know the exact form it'll take. Creed's been working on the language. But the substance is that this town wants to acknowledge what you've done and give you standing here that goes beyond your employment in my house." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the considering look she gave to problems, something different. Something that had more uncertainty in it than he usually saw from her, which was almost none. "Standing?" she said. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you're not just the sheriff's housekeeper anymore. It means Red Hollow is saying officially that you belong here and that your voice carries weight." He paused. "It means if you want to stay beyond the winter, beyond the original arrangement, there's a place for you." The silence went on long enough that Cole began to feel the edges of it. Then Elena said, "What do you want?" He held her gaze. I want you to hear what they have to say, and then tell me what you think. That's all." She nodded slowly. She picked up her cup again and didn't say anything else, and he let it rest there, though the noise in his head had gotten considerably louder. The council meeting was held in Creed's office rather than Voss's back room, which was Creed's way of signaling that this was a legal proceeding of a sort rather than a business discussion. Elena came in her good dress, the dark blue wool one she'd arrived in, which Cole had only seen twice before, and sat in the chair across from the 5 men with her hands folded on the table and her face composed and attentive. Creed spoke for about 10 minutes in the measured, precise language of a man who'd spent 50 years choosing words for their accuracy. He laid out what the town had observed, what the town owed, and what the town was prepared to offer, which amounted to 3 things: a formal letter of civic recognition, a monthly community stipend paid from the town's operational budget for ongoing health and welfare coordination, and the right to use the council chambers for whatever community meetings she determined were needed. Elena listened to all of it without interrupting. When Creed finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to ask a question before I respond." "Of course," Creed said. "The stipend and the chambers, those are practical things, and I appreciate them." She looked at each man in turn the same way Creed had looked around the table at the first meeting. "But what I actually need from this council is something different. I need you to address the Kohler loan with Heller's Bank formally and on record so that Bill Kohler knows the territory assistance process is available to him and that this town is willing to vouch for his application. I need the Webb children and the Hart children and 4 others I can name to have access to a proper expanded school curriculum, not because I want to run a school, but because Clara Webb is doing mathematics 2 years above her grade level in my kitchen because there's nowhere else for her to do it, and I need Dora Platt." The room went very still. Hiram Voss blinked. Frank Garrett made a sound that might have been surprise or might have been admiration. Cole, who was standing against the back wall because he hadn't been given a seat at the table and hadn't asked for one, felt something loosen in his chest. Creed said carefully, "You need Dora Platt." "She knows everyone in this town," Elena said. "She knows their histories, their debts, their family situations, their fears. She's been using that knowledge to police the town's social boundaries, which has cost her a great deal of goodwill. But the knowledge itself is valuable, and she's been wasting it." A pause. "If she has something real to do with it, if her role is to connect people rather than to judge them, she'll do it better than anyone I've met. She just needs to be asked in a way that makes her feel essential rather than corrected." The room was quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then Judge Creed said slowly, "You're asking us to formalize a community welfare network with Dora Platt as its social coordinator." "I'm asking you to let me talk to Dora," Elena said, "and to back me up when I do." Ray Denby laughed a short, genuine sound of pure appreciation. He covered it quickly, but not quickly enough, and it moved around the room like something contagious. Even Hiram Voss was smiling in spite of himself. Creed looked at Elena for a long moment, with the expression of a man who had been practicing law for 50 years and had just encountered an argument he hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter. "Miss Novak," he said, "I believe you may be the most practical person who has ever sat in that chair." "I was a foreign girl in other people's houses for 10 years, Elena said. "You learn to find the fastest way to what actually works." Cole walked home beside her after. They didn't talk for the first block, which was their way. They'd both learned that the other needed transition time between public and private, between performing and resting. The cold had softened in the 2 weeks since the blizzard, not gone, but changed in character, the specific quality of late winter cold that carried a question in it rather than a verdict. After the first block, Cole said, "You never told me about the children, the school curriculum. You never asked." "I should have asked." "Yes," she said without heat, without accusation. "Just agreement." He absorbed that. "Clara Webb's going to be something," he said. "Clara Webb is already something. She just needs someone to tell her the ceiling isn't where she thinks it is." Elena's pace didn't change, but something in her voice did, a warmth that wasn't there when she was talking about logistics, something that belonged to the part of her she didn't show to rooms full of people. She reminds me of myself. At 10, before the people I worked for taught me to shrink. Cole stopped walking. Not dramatically, he just stopped, and she stopped half a step later and turned to look at him. And he looked at her and said, with the directness of a man who'd finally gotten tired of talking around the thing, "Nobody's going to teach you to shrink in my house." Elena held his gaze. The cold air moved between them. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I stayed." She walked on. He stood for 1 second longer and then followed, and neither of them said anything else, and it was exactly enough. The conversation with Dora Platt happened 4 days later on a Wednesday in Elena's kitchen, which was Elena had decided the right location because Dora needed to be somewhere she'd already been changed by, rather than somewhere neutral, and because a kitchen was not a council chamber and did not put anyone on formal footing. Cole was not there. He'd been told he was not needed, and he'd accepted this with the wisdom of a man who'd learned when to trust another person's judgment completely. What happened in that kitchen in the hour between 9 and 10 that Wednesday morning, he pieced together later from Elena's account and from the evidence of Dora Platt's behavior in the weeks that followed. Elena had apparently asked Dora 2 questions, just 2 in the direct, uncomplicated way she asked everything. First, what do you know about the families in this town that nobody else knows? And second, what would you do with that knowledge if someone gave you a reason to use it well? Dora Platt had apparently talked for 45 minutes straight. Elena had apparently listened to all of it. What came out of that hour was not a friendship. Exactly, the 2 women were too different in temperament for friendship to be the right word, but something more durable than friendship, which was a working relationship between 2 people who understood each other's strengths without requiring each other to be different than they were. By April, Dora Platt was making rounds. Not the social surveillance rounds she'd been making since 1879, different rounds. She stopped in at the Hart House to let Mrs. Hart know that the Women's Auxiliary was collecting fabric donations, and that there was no requirement to contribute if the household was short. She appeared at old Caleb Ford's door every Tuesday with a covered dish that she left without fanfare, and whose origin she declined to specify when Caleb tried to ask. She became, in the gradual, unannounced way that real changes happen, the person people called when they needed something navigated and didn't know how to ask officially. Cole watched all of this from the particular vantage point of the person who stood closest to the center of it without being the center himself. He watched Elena's quiet architecture take shape across the town, not as something she'd built by force, but as something she'd made possible by paying attention, by caring about specific people, in specific circumstances, by being exactly who she was without modification or apology. He watched it, and he felt the thing in his chest that had been noise since the blizzard's second night resolve slowly into something quieter and more certain, the way a signal becomes clear when you stop trying to force it and simply wait for the static to settle. He was waiting still, but he was waiting with a direction now, which was different. In the second week of April, a letter arrived from the agency in Philadelphia, the same agency that had sent Elena in November. It was addressed to Elena, which was unusual, because correspondence for her typically came through the general post to her own name, but this was marked with the agency's formal letterhead, and Cole noticed it on the hall table one afternoon when he came home, and he noticed it and did not pick it up, and went to the kitchen and said nothing, and ate his dinner and said nothing, and helped clear the table and said nothing, which was 3 separate occasions on which he'd had the opportunity to say something and had elected not to. The letter sat on the hall table for 2 days. Elena didn't mention it. On the 3rd day, Cole came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found it gone. He found Elena in the kitchen with her coat already on and her canvas bag, the one she'd arrived with, the one she'd carried off the train in November, sitting on the table. His heart did something that he later described to himself only as decisive. "Elena," he said. She turned. Her face was the composed, careful face she used when she was managing something difficult, which told him everything he needed to know about what the letter had said. "It's a placement," she said. "A family in Portland. They're offering 3 times the wage, and they specifically—" She stopped, started again. "It's a good offer." "I know," he said. "I should consider it." "I know that too. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings in Montana do, trying tentatively to be something other than winter, sending small signals of warmth between the cold ones. Cole looked at the canvas bag on the table. He looked at Elena. He thought about a woman who'd stepped off a train in the dark with 17 degrees of cold pressing down on everything. Who'd asked where the woodpile was before she'd taken her coat off. Who'd taught a boy about bread dough and a girl about ceilings, and a whole town about what it looked like when a person simply refused to stop being useful. He said, "Don't go." 2 words. He'd had 4 months to build to them, and that was what came out. 2 words, plain and unadorned, the most honest sentence he'd constructed since he'd taken a badge at 23 and promised to tell the truth. Elena looked at him for a long time. "That's not a good enough reason," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working on the rest of it." The canvas bag stayed on the table. Elena took her coat off and put it on its hook and turned to the stove and said, "Breakfast in 20 minutes." And Cole sat down at the kitchen table where he'd eaten every meal since November, where children did their arithmetic, and old men drank their coffee, and a whole town had slowly, quietly learned to be better than it was, and he thought that whatever came next, it was going to begin here in this kitchen with this woman. He picked up his coffee cup and waited. The rest of it took Cole 4 days to build, not because he didn't know what he wanted to say. He'd known that since the morning he'd watched her take her coat off and put it back on its hook and turn to the stove like the decision had already been made and she was simply waiting for him to catch up. He knew what he wanted. What took 4 days was the certainty that he had the right to want it, that what he felt wasn't gratitude dressed up as something more serious, that Elena Novak deserved a man who'd examined his own motives with the same rigor she applied to everything else and found them honest. He examined them. They were honest. The town didn't know about the letter from Portland. It didn't know about the canvas bag on the table, or the 2 words he'd said, or Elena's coat going back on its hook. What the town knew was that April had arrived, and Elena was still there, still moving through Birch Street and the Mercantile and the kitchen with that same unhurried efficiency, still feeding children and managing ledgers and making things work that had been broken before she got there. The town had stopped questioning why she was there. It had simply absorbed her, the way a body absorbs something it recognizes as necessary. Cole noticed the shift, the way you notice the exact moment winter ends, not in a single event, but in an accumulation of small ones that suddenly add up to something unmistakable. Frank Garrett stopped in at the house on a Monday morning, not to see Cole, but to ask Elena about the cold frame garden she'd mentioned to his wife. Danny Kohler came by on a Thursday with a jar of preserves from his mother and a formality in his posture that was the 14-year-old version of gratitude too large to say directly. Clara Webb appeared every Tuesday and Saturday without fail, and was now working through logarithms that Dr. Pruitt, who'd taken a genuine professional interest in her education, had sourced from a mathematics text he'd ordered from Denver. Elena kept all of these threads without dropping any of them, and Cole watched and thought about what it meant to keep threads, how it required not just competence, but a specific quality of caring that didn't diminish with repetition, that stayed fully present for the 10th person, the same way it had for the first. On the 4th day, a Thursday evening in the 2nd week of April, Cole came home from his rounds and found Elena at the kitchen table, with her ledger and a cup of tea, and he sat down across from her and said, "I've got the rest of it." She put her pen down and looked at him. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't a speech-making man, and she would have trusted him less if he'd tried. He said, "I've been alone in this house for 4 years. Not lonely alone. There's a difference. Lonely is wanting something you don't have. Alone is not noticing the wanting because you've made your peace with the shape of your life. You came off that train in November, and inside of 2 weeks I started noticing the wanting. That scared me, so I didn't look at it directly. I looked at everything around it instead. I looked at what you did for the Harts and for the Denbys and for Danny Kohler and for this town, and I told myself what I felt was appreciation. Professional respect. Admiration from a distance." Elena was watching him with that steady, dark-eyed attention that had been cataloging him since the first night on the platform. "It wasn't that," he said. "It was more than that. It's been more than that for a long time, And I want to stop pretending otherwise, because pretending otherwise means you might get another letter from Portland, and I might say 2 words again instead of the whole truth. And the whole truth is that I want you to stay. Not as my housekeeper. Not as the woman the town relies on, though God knows they do. I want you to stay as mine. If that's something you want. If I'm... He stopped. If I'm someone you could want that with. The kitchen was very quiet. Elena looked at him for long enough that he felt the full weight of the risk he'd just taken, the specific exposed quality of a man who's put the truth on the table and has to wait to find out what it's worth. Then she said, "You're not someone I could want that with, Cole. You're the only person I've wanted it with since I got off that train." A pause. "I've been waiting for you to figure that out without me having to tell you, because I needed to know you'd get there on your own." He looked at her. "You've been waiting. For 4 months. Elena, you're a thorough man," she said, with the faintest edge of something warm underneath the dryness. I respected the thoroughness. I was also losing patience with it. He laughed a real laugh, not the controlled, near smile he usually managed, and it surprised him enough that he let it go on a beat longer than usual, and Elena's face did something he'd never seen it do before, which was break open into a smile of its own, genuine and unguarded. The smile of a woman who'd been keeping herself composed for a very long time and had just been given permission to stop. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with any of the ceremony the moment might have called for in a different story about different people. He just picked up her hand, which was warm and capable, and had built fires and saved a baby and sealed windows and written 1,000 ledger entries in this house, and held it, and she turned her hand and held his back, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. The spring that followed was the kind that made people in Montana forgive the winters. The snow retreated in stages, giving ground reluctantly, but giving it, and the mud that came after was the promising kind, the kind that meant things could grow. Elena's cold frames went in the first week of May 12, of them along the south side of the house, and within a month she had seedlings that made Millie Voss come by specifically to look at them and stay for an hour to learn how they worked. The children came as reliably as they always had, but something in the quality of their visits had shifted. They weren't just coming for warmth and food anymore. They were coming because Elena's kitchen had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the place in Red Hollow, where a young person could walk in with a question and walk out with an answer that treated them like the question was worth asking. Clara Webb brought her younger sister in May. Thomas Garrett started bringing his father's ranch accounts, not because anyone had told him to, but because he'd watched Elena work with numbers long enough to understand that the accounts had errors in them that were costing his father money, and Elena was the person who would know how to fix that without making his father feel foolish. Cole watched Elena with Frank Garrett's accounts one afternoon. Watched her go through the ledger entries with Thomas sitting beside her, asking questions, explaining each adjustment, turning a correction into a lesson, and thought that this was what she'd done, his whole town, one person at a time. Not fix things, taught things. There was a difference, and it mattered enormously, because fixed things broke again without warning. But taught things stayed fixed because the person knew how they worked. Bill Kohler got his territory assistance approved in May. Cole had filed the paperwork in March, 2 days after the blizzard ended, and the territory office had processed it in the usual slow governmental way. But when the letter of approval came, it came with a note from the district land officer saying that the application had been unusually well documented and that the supporting financial analysis was some of the clearest he'd seen. Cole knew whose work that was. He didn't mention it to Bill Kohler because Bill Kohler didn't need to know the mechanics he needed to know his ranch was going to be all right. But he told Elena that evening, and she looked at the letter and looked at the note and said nothing. But she was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she was quiet when something had landed somewhere deep. "Thank you for filing it," she said finally. "You told me to. You didn't have to do it the way you did." He looked at her. "What way's that?" "Thoroughly," she said with that warm undercurrent. "With the full supporting documentation. You didn't have to go back through his accounts for 3 years to build the analysis." "No," he said. "I didn't have to." She looked at him for a long moment, and then turned back to whatever she'd been doing, and he understood that this was her way of receiving something, not with words, but with a returning to the ordinary, a re-entry into the dailiness of their life together, that was itself a kind of gratitude. Their life together. He'd started thinking of it that way sometime in April, without marking the exact moment, which was how the true shifts happened, not announced, just present one day when you looked. The formal question came on a Sunday in late May, which was not a planned Sunday or a particular anniversary of anything but simply the Sunday on which it became clear to Cole that there was no reason to wait any longer, that he'd been patient long enough, that Elena deserved the actual thing, and not just the understood thing. He asked her after supper at the table, which was where they had every important conversation, because the table was the place they were most honestly themselves. No performance, no distance. Just two people who had learned each other thoroughly and found nothing they couldn't live with. He said, "I want to marry you. Not because the town expects it, or because of what people say, or because of what you deserve though you do. Because I want to. Because this house is yours as much as it's mine. And it has been since November, and I want the law to say what's already true." Elena set down her cup with great deliberateness. She was quiet long enough that he began to wonder if he'd miscalculated something, if the hand-holding in April, and the mornings with coffee, and the way she laughed at his dry observations about town council proceedings, meant something different than he'd read them to mean. Then she said, "There's something I should tell you before you decide that." He waited. "I have nothing," she said. "No property, no inheritance, no family money. I have what I've earned and what I've saved, and a canvas bag and a ledger. If you're expecting to marry someone who comes with anything practical—" "Elena," he said. "I'm serious, Cole. You should know the exact inventory." "I know the exact inventory," he said. "I've known it since November. You came off that train with a suitcase and a canvas bag, and you kept every receipt and every figure, and I know exactly what you have, and I know exactly what you're worth, and those two numbers are not the same number." He held her gaze. "I'm asking about the second number." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision and the honesty and the absolute absence of performance that was the most Elena thing about her, she said, "Yes." One word. But she said it the way she did everything fully, without reservation, with her whole self committed to it. The wedding was small, the way both of them wanted it. Judge Creed officiating Millie Voss and Ray Denby as witnesses, the children in their good clothes, looking simultaneously solemn and incapable of containing themselves. Thomas Garrett cried and denied it immediately and fiercely. Clara Webb did not cry, but held Elena's hand for a long time afterward, without speaking, and Elena let her understanding that Clara was filing something away for her own future, use the evidence that a woman could arrive somewhere with nothing and build something that lasted. Dora Platt came. She sat in the second row in her best hat, and she did not make a single comment before, during, or after the ceremony, which was as close to a blessing as she was constitutionally capable of offering, and Elena accepted it as exactly that. Cole stood beside Elena in Creed's office and listened to the words that would make legally true what had been actually true since somewhere around December, and thought about a woman who'd arrived at a train platform in 17-degree cold and looked him dead in the eye and asked where the woodpile was, and about everything she'd done since, not because anyone had required it of her, but because she was the kind of person who looked at what was broken and moved toward it without waiting to be asked. He thought about the town that had whispered about her and then needed her and then slowly become something better than it had been because she'd refused to shrink to fit the size it had assigned her. He thought about the letter from Portland sitting unopened on the hall table, and the canvas bag and the coat going back on its hook, and two words that had led to 4 days of honesty, that had led to this room this morning, this woman standing beside him with her hands steady and her eyes clear, and her whole self present in the way she always was, fully, without reservation, without apology. Judge Creed finished the words. Cole turned to Elena and she turned to him, and he thought that this was the thing nobody told you about the right choice, that it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like arriving somewhere you'd been walking toward for a long time without knowing the name of the place. Red Hollow had wanted a housekeeper for the winter. What Elena Novak brought was something no one had known to ask for. And no one having had it, would ever be able to do without the rare and transforming gift of a woman who showed up completely, worked honestly, loved quietly, and made everything around her more than it had been before she came. Some gifts arrive on the late train in November, carrying only a suitcase and a canvas bag, and they change everything, not loudly, not all at once, but in the patient, permanent way that real things change. One fire built, one ledger, kept, one life made better at a time, until the whole town looks up one spring morning and realizes it has been remade, and the woman who remade it is standing in the kitchen, where she has always stood, exactly where she belongs.